much, Becca and Elizabeth. That was such a wonderful introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here today to see everyone enjoying this, taste of the Gilded Age. And let's get started on dining in the Gilded Age and see what happens. So just a little bit about myself. As Elizabeth said, I've been writing about food since about 2008, and my first book, Mrs. Goodfellow, The Story of America's First Cooking School, led me into my second book, The $1,000 Dinner. So Mrs. Goodfellow was, she was a pastry chef and had the first cooking school in early 800s Philadelphia. And then reading about her, I learned about the $1,000 Dinner because one of her contemporaries, James Parkinson, was a chef in Philadelphia, and he put on this 17-course, 12-hour meal, which they coined the $1,000 Dinner. So cooking competitions were actually a thing back in the 19th century too, believe it or not. And so doing the research for those two books is really what led me to write about food, especially that 19th century. I just love the Gilded Age and Victorian era. And I was recreating all of these recipes because writing about them, I really wanted to deconstruct them and see, what made them tick kind of thing. And I had a blog going, and eventually I said, why don't I just put these into a cookbook, because then people can really enjoy them that way. And with the Gilded Age TV show coming out, the timing was, I felt, so great. So that's where we are today with the Gilded Age Cookbook. So just let's get started on dining in the Gilded Age and see this quote from Harper's Bazaar kind of sums it up. So if you've been invited to a fancy dinner party in the Gilded Age, would you have been greeted to? A table very similar to this with a white linen tablecloth, all the opulent china and crystal and silverware, a lot of floral arrangements. They liked to have really pretty floral arrangements, and even sugar sculptures. They would make arrangements out of real sugar, and those would often be on the table. And the meal would have been definitely multi-course, starting with oysters. Every fine dinner started with oysters, and at this time frame, they would have moved into a soup, either a clear soup like a consommé, or they would have done a turtle soup. That was very popular then. And then into fish dishes, a roast, a palate cleansing sorbet or punch, onto game dishes. They did a lot with canvasback duck and other, maybe a bird like a snipe, and then into cold dishes, which were, if you think of an aspic today, people think of a Jell-O mold too, but they were actually savory dishes, cold cooked food set in an aspic, a gelatin mold, which actually, I always say, served two purposes. It looked pretty, number one, and it also helped preserve food when they didn't have a lot of refrigeration, so they could put it out and not worry about things going bad. And then they would move into eventually the desserts, maybe some cheese before that, but the desserts would often be multi-course too. They would do maybe 2 courses of pastry, ice creams and ices, and then on into finally black coffee. And then the men would go into the one room and have their cigars and their brandy, but the women would do not the cigars, but they would go and maybe have some sherry or something and bonbons, and then they would regroup at the end of the night. So it was a long, drawn-out affair with a lot of food. So let's talk about kind of what the Gilded Age is. It was started in about the 1870s. Some historians say it kind of ended around 1900. I like to say that it lasted until about 1910. Think about up to that time frame right before the Titanic. And it was a term coined by Mark Twain from his book of the same title, The Gilded Age. And yes, it glittered with wealth on the surface, but underneath there was this corruption, and the railroads especially, things weren't regulated yet, so people were kind of doing, the businessmen were kind of doing what they wanted to do, and people even living in tenements as shown in that picture at the bottom. So, and also, everything was being propelled forward by the people that were working for these captains of industry, right? They all had their servants and people working for them. And it was definitely a time of innovation and technology. That's what, really what I talk about throughout this book, is that it really, the innovation is what helped propel the Gilded Age forward. And here we are with the railroad industry magnates. So you have that caricature with the big nose, that's James Gould, and then the other picture are various Vanderbilts, Cornelius, the Commodore, and then William H. and William K. And I always say the glittered, Gilded Age mansions of Newport and New York were really built by the railroads, because that was a huge part of the Gilded Age and where all the money kind of came from. The Vanderbilts, as people may know too, also they had steamships, and that was another. So all this transportation was one way that the money was being made, and the railroads helped too with the food, because so people could travel more and the food could travel like further distances without going bad. They had refrigerated cars eventually, and you could get things where they needed to go in a much shorter time than in the past. So people were getting more foods that they couldn't have gotten before. So that was all part of this whole Gilded Age. And then we have to talk about the servant issue in the Gilded Age as well. With all this increased wealth, people really wanted their housekeepers to be cooks too, and they didn't necessarily have that skill. They could be a housekeeper maybe, but not necessarily a cook. So they would, the hired help wasn't able to cook the food properly up to the standards of what these wealthy people wanted. So what happened? A lot of people of Irish descent came over at this time, and the poor Irish girls couldn't necessarily, like I said, cook the foods. They didn't even know how to use a cook stove maybe sometimes, because they didn't have the same technology. So without this knowledge of the equipment, so cooking schools became a huge thing. We don't necessarily think of it, but there was especially this French chef named Pierre Blot. He had come over to the U.S. from France in the mid-19th century, and he said, hey, there's no formal cooking school. Everyone wanted French food. They thought, they were elite, we want this French food, but nobody knows how to really cook it, so let me teach people. And that's what he did. He organized this school, and he was quite a showman. He called it the New York Cooking Academy, and he was professor of gastronomy, and he was really trying to elevate cooking in the U.S. to a level that he didn't think was here. And one thing that's really important about him is he held classes for the servants. So the ladies in these households would send their servants to his classes. But the ladies themselves would go too, because he was such an entertaining chef that they really liked to see him perform in a lot of ways. So, he was popular that way. He also even, sometimes bachelor men he had classes just for bachelor men too. So he had all these different classes, and he even traveled around the country with these cooking shows kind of thing. You have to think about, this was way before the internet and YouTube and any of that stuff. So this was their entertainment. People would go to see him perform and elevate the cooking. Like I said, he just really was determined to improve American cooking. And one of his proteges, her name was Juliette Corson, his cooking academy was so successful that it really started a cooking school revolution. Pierre Blot's kind of lectures and philosophies even caught the eye of the Vanderbilts. So Margaret Vanderbilt Shepherd, she was the daughter of the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, and she helped establish cooking classes at the YWCA. And Juliette Corson would teach them also this New York cooking school. And the same thing, she taught not only working women, but debutantes too would go to her classes. So it was this you know, we think of today, people go to cooking school to work in a restaurant or, you know, be maybe a food critic or something. But years ago, it was to really learn the techniques so that you could have these dinner parties and host things in your home, either your servants knew how to do it or you knew how to do it, and tell them what they needed to know. So it was very important at the time. So the United Charities building, that was one location where the debutantes and the young, you know, the working women would take classes at the same classrooms, but the debutantes would go in the morning or during the day, and they often wouldn't even take off their gloves or anything. They just would kind of observe, whereas the working women would go in the evening after they were done working and actually get their hands dirty and do the actual learning of the cooking. So for the affluent, it was a way to pass the time, and often their mothers would really want them to go. But the working women, this was a way for them to you know, propel themselves to a new type of career, or just to learn you know, more that they needed to know to work. So Emily Vanderbilt Sloan, she attended these cooking classes, and she actually was said to enjoy it and was a really good pupil. And she even, at her wedding, she donated money to this cooking school because she thought it was so important that you know, these working women and debutantes go to the cooking school. And then another Vanderbilt, Margaret Vanderbilt Shepard's daughter Edith, also would attend classes. So there was that whole connection as well. And then another woman who was really important, Sarah Tyson Wurr. She had the Philadelphia Cooking School, and from the late 1870s through the early 20th century, she was very important, especially in Philadelphia, but also around the country. She would also, like Pierre Blot, would give these lectures to packed auditoriums. There was often like standing room. She was so popular, especially these food demos. She would work with, this was a big thing too in these early days of food marketing. She would work with companies like Baker's Chocolate and baking powder and baking soda companies, because this was a way for these food companies to market themselves. And again, like, how else were you going to get your name out if you're a company? Like, there were magazines and newspapers, but also through people like Sarah Rohr, you know, they would just spread the word about how these different ingredients, because they were newfangled and, you know, in their day, how to really let people know that these can help you in your cooking. And in addition to the lectures being sold, another place she would go to World's Fairs and these kind of other food demo places. So the 1893 World's Fair, she was hugely popular and, you know, had a lot of lectures there as well. And now I want to move into ladies' luncheons, because they were a very integral part of the Gilded Age. It was a way for women to meet with friends, form new acquaintances, kind of widen their social circle, kind of pay off social obligations. So they were given by ladies to ladies, typically. And they often would feature some kind of entertainment, whether it be like somebody speaking, like an orator, or a musician, or somebody like singing. So there was some kind of entertainment. There were also club lunches. So there were certain like women's clubs, which some of them were rather progressive for their time. One in Philadelphia was called the Sedgley Club, and it was actually a Philadelphia women's bike, barge, and canoe club. So they did that in addition to, you know, hosting their lunches. And another type they had starting in about the 1890s were called standing luncheons. And I think of those as kind of like an open house that we would think of today, where you go and just kind of mingle, but not like a sit-down luncheon. And they would often do that during the social season and then go to a ball later in the later in the evening. So like they had this kind of set plan of what they would do during the week, and go to a luncheon, and then we're going to go home and change, and then into your really fine gown so you can go to this ball or a banquet or something. So it was just a different kind of theme. So what were some of the foods served? Well, we can't really talk about luncheons without talking about lobster. They were one of the most frequently featured salads at luncheons. And a lot of times they would do some kind of fish salad. They thought it was like a lighter dish. It wasn't as heavy as some of these other foods. And lobsters at the time were really just beginning their ascent as a status symbol. For years, lobster wasn't necessarily, like it was given to animals to eat even. It was just so plentiful along this East Coast that it wasn't necessarily a status food until canning actually helped elevate lobster, believe it or not, because they could can lobster and then with the railroad send it all over the country, and people could have lobster that couldn't necessarily have it before because they didn't live near a coast. And then it just became so overfished and overdone, and then much more in demand. So there's a little story about that in the book about lobster that it's pretty interesting how some of these foods, how they kind of evolved to what they are today. And then another food, quintessential cake of the Gilded Age is the sponge cake. And it really had endless style formulations where you could add lemon to it or orange or some other flavoring, or just have it plain with some confectioner sugar like shown there. And it was really, one reason it became even more popular during the Gilded Age was actually the invention of the egg beater. Again, we have these innovations, but before the egg beater, women had to whip the eggs for such a long period of time by hand, and the servants often, of course, had to do that. But the egg beater really helped, speed up the process. So that's one reason that sponge cakes became so, popular during that time frame. And now we're going to talk about tea. So the same thing as the luncheons, tea was a very important and popular kind of event to attend. Again, a way for women to extend their social circle. They would call on each other and, have this whole progression of how they would, I attended your tea party, so now I'm going to have one, and that kind of thing. And if you had a tea, if you were the hostess, you would stand by the drawing room door, which is the parlor door, and kind of greet people as they came in, almost like, if you think about it, like a receiving line at a wedding or something. You greet the hostess, and then you go in and you would see this tea table set like this. And it would have the flower arrangements, the tea services at one end, and some of the tea treats. Often they would have a specific color theme. Teas were usually women, but men would attend too sometimes, and even some of the teenage boys and girls, because it was also a way to do some matchmaking for these families, and this was an event where it was like safe for them to be chaperoned and nothing was going to happen kind of thing, and they could meet each other. So that was another ways teas were important. And in addition to tea, and they would have coffee, believe it or not, hot chocolate was a hugely popular thing to have at a tea party. And at this time, chocolate was starting to become more available, but for the longest time, it was really just a drinking beverage. Once they figured out how to process chocolate, because there's the cocoa, to separate the cocoa from the butter fat, it wasn't added to a lot of baked goods because it wouldn't mix in well with the flour and the other ingredients. So hot chocolate, we think of them kind of as the same thing today, hot chocolate and hot cocoa, but they were two totally different beverages. The hot chocolate was they would grate chocolate and then add egg yolks and milk and sugar and make it really rich. If anyone's ever gone to Europe, a lot of times, like in Belgium especially, they'll just bring out this pot of chocolate to the table for breakfast, and that's the kind of beverage the chocolate would be. The hot cocoa was reserved more for, if I'm not feeling well, if I'm sick, or for children, and it was more like they considered it more of like a healthier food because it was lighter, it didn't have as much sugar or even any sugar, and maybe some milk, but not as rich. And people like Boston Cooking School instructor Fannie Farmer even recommended it for children and said it's a nutriment as well as a stimulant. So that's the kind of beverage they would have for children. And so what are some of the tea foods? They actually didn't have a huge amount of food at a tea party because, and I can imagine, if they're all socializing, there just wasn't the opportunity to really eat very much, but they did have like the bread and butter sandwiches. They might have been rolled up or cut into little triangles like that. Some tea cakes. Fruit like the strawberries shown there, maybe some bonbons or salted nuts, and then sometimes they would do frozen drinks like frozen coffee or even frozen cherries or something, depending on the time of year. Or if it was wintertime, they might have some bouillon too on the table for people to try. So those were the types of foods that they would have. And now I want to talk about eating clubs, because so the men had their own activities that were called eating, sometimes called dining or glutton clubs, and it was a way to meet, share information. They would do like their business deals sometimes and just enjoy each other's company. They were often secretive and private. So the Colony in Schuylkill in Philadelphia is also known as the Fish House Club, or the Schuylkill, or the State in Schuylkill, they called it sometimes. If anyone's ever heard, they actually had this really potent fish house punch that was a bunch of different liquors mixed together that they would have. What they would do is fish, right along the banks of the Schuylkill, and also and hunt, and then just cook whatever they made and right there on the banks, and then enjoy it, wash it down with this fish house punch. And then also the Clover Club, which was at the Hotel Bellevue on Broad Street. That was another really important club organized in 1882. So that one, they actually dined. They had this clover-shaped table. This is a menu from 1907, but the table was reserved for their dinners, this clover-shaped. They often invited guests to partake in the food, and they were very, they could really kind of go off the rails sometimes with their behavior, apparently. They invited Mark Twain to one of their dinners, and he was shocked kind of at their behavior. Think of it as those, when I say a roast, meaning, when somebody's roasted, like when you're talking about them, that's kind of what they did, and they would just get kind of, crazy and have their dinner and enjoy each other. They're actually still around today, the Clover Club. They're still in business. So, and then I want to talk about, there was actually a circle of activity in New York among African Americans, especially, the Civil War had ended. Many people of color moved to Brooklyn, especially in New York, and they had their own social activities, whether or not it was debutante balls, dinners. They even had, they would go to Newport here and Long Island, different excursions, and their social club scene was really thriving. A lot of them, they would have been teachers, ministers, doctors, pharmacists, working in all these different industries, and they had, this wealth equal to $2 million. So just important to note that there was this other, component going on at the same time, and they liked to go to Newport as well. And then dinner parties, banquets and balls. This was really a way for the rich to show off their wealth. And, again, who's wearing what? What am I serving at my ball or banquet? And can I top you when I give mine the next time, because I see what you're doing at yours? So it was just a way to show off and host Also, as families started moving further away from the business districts, especially in cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, whatever. And so the men that were working, it would take them longer to get home. It was almost like this, the beginnings of the suburbs and commuting. So they made the dinner hour later so that the men could partake in the activity when they got home. So dinners got later and later over time. And the whole multiple courses, as I said, the soup to nuts thing. And so there were people like the really lavish banquets and balls. We can't mention those without discussing Caroline Astors. She's in the middle there and on the left, and then Ward McAllister. The two of them really flaunted their wealth and defined who was in. They had this list of the 400 that they deemed were the only socially worthy people to associate with. And allegedly it was because 400 was the limit of people that could fit in Caroline's ballroom. But then I read that there was some debate about it, that the New York Tribune said that that was nonsense, that it was because Charles Delmonico created the 400 when he built a hall that would fit 400 people. But I don't know. I mean, the story with the Caroline and Ward, it seems to continue today. So, I mean, that's the one that everyone knows about. And now, so the Vanderbilts were considered new money. And Alva Vanderbilt especially, who was the wife of William, really wanted to be in. And so she held this lavish housewarming ball in her new French mansion here, French chateau-style mansion. And she purposely snubbed Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, forcing her to call on her and then eventually let the Vanderbilts into their social circle. So anyone that watches the Gilded Age TV show, that's the ball that provided the inspiration for Bertha Russell, who throws in the Gilded Age TV show. She has to let her daughter in. So that was based on some truthful story. And then after that, then the Vanderbilts were into this 400 in society. And I have to talk about sometimes some of these dinners and balls would get kind of crazy. So Mamie Fish, she was the wife of Stuyvesant Fish, he was a railroad magnate, and Harry Lair loved to do these kind of off-the-cuff dinners. Like Mamie had a dinner for her dogs at one time, and they all had like diamond dog collars and everything. It was kind of bizarre. But one time Mamie was actually traveling here to Newport on a ship, and she met this little monkey on the ship. His name was Jocko. And she said, oh, I'm going to invite him to a party hosted by the Lairs, so Harry Lair and his wife, Elizabeth Drexel Lair. And all she said is, I'm bringing a guest to your party. And so they had a seat at the table for this guest of honor. She dressed this poor little monkey up in she had a little suit made for him especially, like with little trousers and everything, and a little watch and chain, which they had to eventually take away because he kept wanting to eat it. So she shows up with this monkey. They put him at this head of the table. Everything's going fine at first, and then they give him some liquor to drink, and then he starts throwing glasses at people around the table, and all the ladies are like running away screaming kind of thing. So it just was really crazy. And then later on, of course, because all the press about it, then Harry said, that didn't happen that way, whatever, but it did. So it's just to show kind of some of the crazy things. So. And then banquet garnishes. So the food was always really showy, theatrical, just, think as over the top as you can imagine. So game dishes especially, you can see like pheasants and other game birds, but often they would put the real feathers, like stick them in there as garnishes. The heads were often left on game if they're on the platter. Birds could be served whole sometimes. And then you have these like skewers that were put in the top of food. They were called atolets or hatolets. And there would be like little, they would put coxcombs on there, or mushrooms or truffles, like little bits of really rich foods. And that was just to make the dish more showy and, try to make it theatrical in its own way. And then at the same time, we have to talk about the rise of the restaurant, because that really started to happen in this time frame too, where restaurants and hotels really experienced explosive growth, especially because people were really moving to the big cities, not only New York, but other big cities as well. There was, Delmonico's really catered to, the uber wealthy, as well as basic eateries for the growing middle class too. And Delmonico's had several locations throughout New York, including Fifth Avenue and 14th Street, which was the site of a famous dinner with Charles Dickens. That was in 1868. So it was really important just how much restaurants, they went, in 1847 there was only about 100, and then by the 1860s there were over 5,000. So that's just New York alone. Charities is another restaurant. So Louis Sherry, he was a savvy and smart entrepreneur. He really had his finger on the pulse of the Gilded Age elite. Especially the Astors were one of his most famous clients, and he hosted all kinds of balls and suppers, and he opened up his Sherry's restaurant right across from Delmonico's. He knew who his competition was, and so they kind of vied for who's going to serve the most of the wealthy people. And it's rumored that Caroline Astor actually helped fund his business, although he said, no, I got here just because I knew what everyone wanted to hear and do, and what to provide for them. So he said he climbed his own ladder to success. And now I want to move things outdoors, because in the Gilded Age, people like to entertain outdoors as well as inside. So, in the warmer months, especially, you think about, there was no air conditioning then, so it was really stuffy, especially in bigger cities. So, they had these strawberry fetes and festivals that were really important and popular. Especially, you think about, like, all winter, people are cooped up. Strawberry season comes around, and they moved outside. And they were often sponsored by churches and schools as like charity events, and they would sell tickets and raise money for different fundraisers and such. And they would have all kinds of strawberries in every way, shape, and form you can imagine. Strawberry whips, strawberries and cream, strawberry shortcake, so they'd have all these different dishes laid out. And then also ice cream socials were another really popular entertainment outside. Just like the strawberry fetes, they were held as fundraisers. And women liked to wear these long white dresses. The men would wear these broad straw hats. They would often be like under the shade of trees, just to be outside and enjoying some cold treats of the ice cream. And I have to talk about ice cream cones, because this was also another thing that became a thing in the Gilded Age. At first, there would have been, if they wanted to hand out ice cream at an ice cream social, they would have had glass dishes or maybe some paper cones. They became available, or paper dishes. But in the early 1900s, at the World's Fair in St. Louis, that's where this Ernest Hamway was selling his Persian waffles next to an ice cream vendor. And the two gentlemen got together and said, hey, let's, roll these into a cone shape. And then, the whole idea really got popularized through this World's Fair Cornucopia ice cream sandwich company. And, this Ernest Hamway wasn't the first one to invent the ice cream cone, but he's the one to really bring the idea to fruition and popularize it. So it's just kind of interesting. And then picnics. Eating out of doors in general wasn't a new concept, but it definitely was a popular activity. And as you can see by these ladies enjoying picnics by a lake, a lot of times too, traveling to a lake or some other, or even by the seaside. It was cooler there, so a place to just enjoy eating outside. And This is from this book, 1891, Dining Room and Kitchen by Grace Townsend. Her book is like a how-to of how to do picnics, with a lot of advice that we follow today, like to put your 2 rolls buttered together and wrap them up in paper, and also cookies taste better than cake at a picnic, kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of advice. She also mentions lemonade and, how to take lemonade to a picnic, which, nowadays we have powdered stuff or we have bottles of Snapple or something. But back then you would have to make up like a sugar syrup with lemon, put it in a jar to make this thin syrup, and then add water when you got to your picnic kind of thing to, make your own concentrate of a lemonade, which I think is a pretty good idea, actually. And then Saratoga chips. So, we take potato chips for granted. We just have bags of them, constantly at a picnic especially. But Saratoga chips actually were the precursor to potato chips, and they came from this restaurant called Moon's Lake's House in Saratoga Springs, where they say one day a fussy customer who apparently it was Commodore Vanderbilt, that, according to legend, he said, these sliced potatoes are too thick. I want them sliced thinner than that. So finally the cook sliced them so thin, fried them in oil, and that was Saratoga chips, which then became potato chips, and the rest is history. So Gilded Age, that's another invention that happened. And here we go with, being in Newport, entertaining outside. A lot of the summer entertaining moved to Newport in the summer. Not only, people from New York, but all over the country, frankly, would come here to Newport to have balls, luncheons, dinner parties, all kinds of events. The cooler shoreline attracted, it was definitely people flush with money. Not only Newport, but also Narragansett. Really just to escape the stifling heat of the city. It was the place to be and to cool off. And then in these 2 pictures of the breakers to show just once the Vanderbilts were in, then they could host all kinds of society events, and they would here in Newport as well. Many exclusive social clubs. One of the most exclusive was called Newport's Gooseberry Island Fishing Club, with just 14 members of all these, the big names of society, such as Vanderbilt, Belmont, Fish, and Dwyer. So it was really one of the most exclusive places to be for some of these clubs and entertaining. And one thing I read was that Narragansett was actually a little more free and easy, whereas Newport was considered, a little more rigid, so that a lot of the young girls would go to Narragansett, actually, where they could, it says, flirt, dance, bathe in the surf, and eat ice cream. So they often would do that, go to Narragansett instead of being just in Newport. So. And then Newport was also the site of many Gilded Age balls. So one was called a Domino Ball, which was in 1884, and that was in a September time frame. And domino costumes, it's actually a throwback to masquerade balls of the 18th century, and where they would wear this, it was a very, almost like a large cloak a lot of times, that covered the entire body, sometimes with a hood. So a lot of these, and they included some of these dances, like a German dance, or which was also a cotillion called, and some of these balls, the estimated cost could have been up to $6,000 then, which could be like $190,000 today. So that was another important activity, these domino type balls. And then East Coast beaches were also really popular destinations for people. This is a picture of a place in Atlantic City. Especially Philadelphians favored Atlantic City and Cape May as places to go. And I just had to quote this. I saw this travel guide from the 1890s claiming just Atlantic City, definitely different than what you think of today with the casinos, because they talk about the shade trees and avenues that you could do riding or driving your horses, you know. And even the sewers are mentioned as a selling point. They say the sewerage system is exceptionally good, and the supply of pure, wholesome water from the mainland is apparently inexhaustible. So it's just funny, like what the selling points were back then in order to visit a place and just have your, you know, your summertime activity. And then New Yorkers often would go to Long Branch. Coney Island, Seagirt were also locations where they would go, and all would have been just a relief to, you know, to get some fresh sea air. And I just wanted to talk about that some of the Gilded Age cottagers would actually lengthen their summer season by staying in Newport long after Labor Day. Often until Thanksgiving, where they would have dinner parties, luncheons, fishing and sailing trips throughout the fall. So there were often large Thanksgiving gatherings in Newport. Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Vanderbilt held one in 1903. He's the one that actually died aboard the Lusitania in 1915, but at the time he was married to this Ellen Tuck. And then also Mrs. Frederick Vanderbilt, shown in this picture, she hosted the annual Thanksgiving dinner for the newsboys and telegraph messengers, which was attended by the mayor and other prominent features. So these were all people that would continue their time in Newport past the summer season and have different events. And so now we're going to move into the holidays, because just like today, it was a huge time of year where you'd have to plan in advance for both Thanksgiving and Christmas time. And, you know, a lot of people had servants, but some did not. And no matter what, you know, somebody's doing the planning. And a lot of times the women would really do a lot of that themselves, whether or not they were doing the work, that they definitely had to plan for this huge meal. And so the Christmas dinner, this is from the Ladies' Home Journal from the late 1800s, and just to show you, so some of the things you would recognize being on menus today, you know, they have the roast turkey, there's some sweet potatoes, but a lot of and they have the cranberry jelly, but a lot of things you're probably wondering, like, why is celery on the menu? Peas served in turnip cups is kind of unusual, and then deviled spaghetti too, which is featured in the cookbook as a recipe, which I say it's like it's like macaroni and cheese in a way, but it's with an egg sauce. So you hard-boiled eggs and make a white sauce out of that, and it really is delicious. My son loves it especially, and he always likes it when I serve it. So it's just it's interesting to see the different foods. And now I want to talk about specifically celery, because you think of it today as being just served on a crudité. In fact, I had it at the Marble House. We had lunch at the tea house today, and I had a crudité like with my hummus. And that's how you think of celery today, or maybe you chop it up and put it in chicken salad. But in the Gilded Age, it was a really fancy food that was often put on the table in a vase like that. So I always say, if you go home, a vase that you have might actually be a celery stand if it's been in your family long enough of a time. And people have come back and told me, I think I have a celery. So it's because it was, celery came from the Mediterranean originally. It was difficult to grow here. Like, a lot of people had to cultivate it in a hothouse. It just was not easy to grow until eventually they came up with the varieties after breeding it enough time, you know, to know, like, now it grows a lot easier, obviously, and now we don't elevate it like this. But in addition to the stands, they also had like a low boat, kind of like a silver, like a tray that they would serve it on. And sometimes they would braise it or cook it in a way, but it was often raw like this on the table, and it was just a fancy food. And then desserts, of course, were important, and I always talk about plum pudding. It's front and center here. One of the most, you know, popular foods served at Christmas dinner. You know, I always say, even the poor Cratchit family in A Christmas Carol had it on their holiday table. So that's how important plum pudding was. But But it originated as a savory pudding back in the medieval times. So it actually had some kind of meat in it and often vegetables. And then over time, they started adding these other ingredients. There never has been really plums in it. I mean, the plums are the dried variety, like a prune. And then eventually they added things like raisins, currants, maybe some apple, eggs to make it richer. Liquor can be added, or milk or cider. There's just any number of ingredients. You can look at, everyone makes their plum pudding a little bit different. But today, people still do make it, usually with suet, if you can find it, which is the fat that surrounds the kidneys of beef or mutton. I often use lard if I can't find suet, so when I bake my plum pudding, it actually smells like bacon cooking, kind of. But yeah, so it's just kind of interesting, and all the spices too. That's what makes it, all the spices. And years ago, they would make it ahead of time, put it in a pudding bag and store it like for a few weeks, and that it would actually, the flavors would all meld together, kind of thing. And then, so New Year's Day was also a festive time. Not New Year's Eve like we think of today, but New Year's Day, where in both New York and Newport, they would often have balls. In 1890, William Hunter, he was a real estate magnate. He had one for Newport Society members at the Masonic Hall, decorated with tons of greenery and tapestries. He led a cotillion dance. And several famous guests attended there. So just kind of, also Newport people would come back, for this kind of New Year's celebration too. And all these things really help define the Gilded Age and its significance to America's culinary history. These are just some other places and events that they would do. More and more people had the wherewithal to live in style and comfort. There was this growing middle class, and the unique types of food they saw. It really, like I said, the innovations and things that were changing over time, really, the food changed with that. That was all part of it as well. And also it's significant to know, like I mentioned, there were people, that maybe, started out like coming out of the Civil War, the people of color who could go into new careers and actually success stories, and women too. Women, there were some tea rooms in New York owned by women, and the suffrage movement was starting. So it was all these different social things that were happening as well as the food. And the style and excessiveness, though, is what really continued to be a source of fascination today, as we know from television and other things. So that's it, and I just wanted to thank everyone. Please do go on my website if you want and see what else. I do post on my blog new recipes and things like that. So it was great to meet all of you today, absolutely. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions about anything.
I've always been impressed by the wretched excess of the dinner parties they used to have and the multi-courses. Were guests expected to partake of every course?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, especially because my second book, The $1,000 Dinner, was 17 courses. Are you eating all that? Number one, I think the portions were a lot smaller, and I think you probably would, if you're at a multi-course dinner, you're getting like a little tasting. You might have gotten served more than that, and I always say too, like the women, I don't know how they were eating that much, because they were like in these tight, like really strapped in there, so I don't know how much they were really eating at any of those things, so.
Changing of the cutlery and the dinner plates must have been.
Exactly, and they had so many servants helping with all of that, absolutely. And I do think the food, was mostly for show. It really was like a way to show off. And it was eaten too, obviously, but it really was more about the appearance, the way it looked, and showing off your social status. Absolutely. So.
It's interesting that just a few decades before the Gilded Age, the oysters were the poor man's food in New York.
Yep.
That's what the prostitutes ate. If you went
Mm-hmm.
to the 5 Points,
Yep.
you see that.
Absolutely, and I actually, it's funny, in my second book I talk about that a lot because there's the whole course, the oyster course. But yeah, oysters have seesawed between being a sustenance food and a fine dining food throughout history. Oysters get so easily overfished, that's what it is, and then they were also hit by a couple of diseases in the 20th century. That's why one reason they're so expensive today, although they're getting better because now they're farming a lot of the oysters, and oysters are a natural filter too for different, they live in those brackish waters and it just filters that out. But you're right.
A lot of people getting sick too because of foodborne illnesses.
Yeah, that was more in the 20th century, but you're right about it being. Oysters were a street food too, served, and they had oyster bars, which weren't like illicit, like a speakeasy, but they were often in the basement. You would go downstairs, so it had kind of an enticing feel. It weren't illegal or anything, but yeah. So oysters, like lobster too. Like I was saying, how they, a lot of it just has to do with us eating too much. There's too many of us who are eating too much, and overfishes things. Turtle too. Green sea turtle was on every menu, turtle soup, until that was overfished, and now they're endangered. So, they moved into terrapin, overfished that. Now it's snapper, you see that on some snapper soup. But it's there's only so much to go around, and then,